Okay, welcome back. In the second half of Chapter 16, we'll be talking about some notable emerging viral diseases, and I've got this divided into two parts. So, in the first part, we'll talk about arboviruses, which are arthropod transmitted infections, and then we'll talk about basically animal transmitted infections, aka vertebrate zoonoses. And so, by far, the vast majority of these emerging viral diseases are vectored in some way. So, either by arthropods or by other animals. And you can see some, commonly these are going to be either mosquitoes or ticks or birds of some kind, bats, rodents typically. So I'll kind of revisit this table as we go through this part of the lecture, but you can see here they've got this broken down by virus family. You can see specific examples of particular viruses in those families, what the natural reservoir is, and then the animals that may transmit those to humans. And in some cases, right, these are human to human transmitted, but we're going to focus on those that are not. And, just glancing at the right column here, right, we see some themes emerging, right? We've got rodents popping up over and over again. We've got bats popping up over and over again, mosquitoes. And there are some exotic things on here, like look at some of the other coronaviruses, right? And we saw this even with COVID-19. Palm civets were implicated. MERS, which is a version of the coronavirus that has been problematic, particularly in the Middle East, has been shown to be transmitted to humans by camels, of all things, in certain instances. But we'll focus primarily on some of these more common non-human transmissions. And so to focus on the arboviruses, so that term actually comes from arthropod-borne viruses. And arthropods are, of course, invertebrates, right? They've got an exoskeleton. And usually when we're talking arthropods and viral transmission, we're talking about mosquitoes or ticks. And we've seen this huge explosion in the number of identified arboviruses. So in 1930, basically 90 years ago, there were 6 arboviruses that had been identified. Only one of those, yellow fever virus, caused disease in humans. But as of 5 years ago, CDC catalog listed over 500 known arboviruses. About a quarter of those been shown to cause disease in humans. So it's this ever-growing list, right? Bottom line, there's a lot of these arboviruses out there. The vast majority of these tend to be RNA viruses, just FYI. And we've got a few different key families here, the Bunyaviridae, Flaviviridae, and Togaviridae. It includes stuff like West Nile, yellow fever, Rift Valley fever. The main one we're going to talk about is dengue, because it's by far the most common of the arboviruses, at least in 2020. So just to talk a little bit about some of the cycles of disease involving arboviruses. So most of these get maintained in these transmission cycles between the arthropod, the insect, and some vertebrate host, which is usually either a bird or some other small mammal, rodent typically. So you'll get this, what's called the enzootic cycle, where the virus is just cycling between that arthropod vector to one of these small animal hosts, and then potentially back to the mosquito or tick or whatever the arthropod happens to be. So in many cases, and this can vary, but in many cases the arthropod could be infected for its entire lifespan, which of course in the case of mosquitoes is just going to be a few weeks, but ticks have been shown to be able to live for years, so that could be a substantial length of time. And it has also been demonstrated that virus can be transmitted vertically in some instances within those insect populations, meaning once infected, that population is likely to stay infected even if the virus is not being passaged back from these other animals. Um, so that enzootic cycle, example here would be like Japanese encephalitis virus, infects birds, can't be amplified in other animals like pigs. So we get stuck in this cycle going from mosquitoes to birds back to mosquitoes. But there can be what are called epizootic cycles, where now the insect transfers the virus to some other animal population, pig in this example, and that virus is now passage directly um, animal to animal. So we get this big epidemic within the animal population. And of course, while that's going on, it's also being passed back to the insect populations and being further spread by those insects. So essentially, that epizootic cycle is just amplifying the amount of virus out there in the world, right? You're getting this big explosion within the animal population. And then humans really come into the equation with what's called an urban cycle. And of course, that's because of urbanization, right? People living together in higher population density areas. Um, so in the urban cycle, the virus is getting transmitted from the arthropod to humans and back. If the virus is causing a viremia, remember that term means virus in the bloodstream. If it's causing a large enough viremia that when a mosquito bites an infected person, a mosquito could actually become infected and then further transmit the virus. And we see this urban cycle with yellow fever virus. We see it with dengue, which we're going to talk about. And of course, you could get this move between the epizootic cycle and the urban cycle too. If you have people coming into contact with these animal populations that are heavily infected. So as I mentioned, dengue is the most common arbovirus in the world at the moment. You have over 400 million people being infected every year, about 12,000 deaths a year, so it's a significant problem. It's considered a re-emerging virus because we've seen a big expansion of the range of its primary vectors, which are these two species of mosquitoes. And of course, that expansion is believed to be driven primarily by climate change, right? Global warming. Um, so these two mosquito species right now are primarily just found in this relatively narrow latitude band between 35 degrees south and 35 degrees north at lower elevations, basically anywhere where the nighttime temperature doesn't drop below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But as the globe warms, right, we're seeing that temperature restriction spreading in terms of its geography. So as the mosquitoes spread, so does the virus. And as I mentioned, dengue primarily spread via this urban transmission cycle. And you can see here parts of the world where dengue infections are a bigger problem, right? So green, basically no annual infections, although we are starting to now see some infections popping up in the United States. And then the more yellow, orange, or red, the more infections you get. So you can see, right, basically equatorial South Africa, South America, parts of Africa, and really hardest hit would be parts of Asia. So just to dig a little bit more into dengue here, we've got 4 different serotypes, dengue virus 1 through 4. They are unique enough that having immunity against one doesn't provide you protection against the others, so you could theoretically become independently infected with 4 different flavors of dengue virus. In terms of the clinical disease, within a week of being bitten by an infected mosquito, you usually get a viremia that can last a week to a week and a half. There can be some human-to-human transmission, but it's only going to be through, blood transfusions or organ transplants or perinatal transmission. So it's not a respiratory virus being passed person to person. As I was alluding to, the virus could be transmitted back to mosquitoes. So a mosquito bites an infected individual, and they can then transfer that infection to somebody else. the vast majority, 3/4 of infections, have been shown to be asymptomatic. There is a vaccine in development, but I'll go into some of the symptoms that you can get in the other fourth of those infected. And so in terms of the case definition, remember for every viral disease, you'll have a case definition. In this case, they have it divided into dengue without warning signs, with warning signs, and then severe dengue. And severe is where you're going to get the majority of the fatalities. So about 5% of individuals with severe dengue may not recover, and those that do, it's a very long road to recovery. But the dengue without warning signs are just kind of relatively mild, generic sort of viral symptoms. With warning signs, you start to get some things that are a bit more alarming, like mucosal bleeding, liver enlargement, and then with severe dengue, you've got much more severe bleeding, organ failure, things that could definitely be life-threatening. And lastly, I did just want to point out in terms of controlling arboviruses, obviously that's very difficult, right? Because you're dealing with insects that may have huge populations and are moving around. But most of the control measures are aimed directly at trying to eliminate the vector. So this would involve, just covering things from like covering up or using mosquito netting to insect repellent to actively trying to eliminate the insects themselves through spraying, or there's some new somewhat controversial genetic techniques like gene drives that can basically use genetic engineering to essentially sterilize insect populations and prevent them from reproducing. In terms of human disease, that seems like a no-brainer. That would be a good thing. But then there's I guess the controversy comes in terms of, well, what would eliminating these large insect populations do to the environment and the ecosystem as a whole? All right, so that's the spiel on arboviruses. So let's talk for a few minutes about some of the animal transmitted vertebrate zoonoses. And although you do see zoonoses coming from domesticated animals, primarily we're concerned with wild animals, rodents, bats, as we saw in this table, right? So we see lots of different viruses being spread by rodents, for example. And I'll talk for just a few minutes about this Arenaviridae group. That includes some scary viruses that can cause hemorrhagic fevers like Lassa fever, Machupovirus. So these would be symptomatically very similar to Ebola, which we'll also talk about. But arenaviruses are enveloped. They're said to be ambisense, which just means that both strands of their genome can be transcribed, which is somewhat unusual. They've got a segmented genome. And as I mentioned, several of these can cause hemorrhagic fever, which is that term comes from the fact that you have a fever and you're hemorrhaging, you're bleeding uncontrollably. And we've basically seen this kind of slow and steady increase in the number of arenaviruses that have been identified. So every few years we seem to discover a new one. They each seem to have pretty specific geographic areas in which their defined hosts are found. And as we can see in this table down here, right, we look at the natural hosts are typically either mice or rats, wild mice or rats, usually, although we do have the house mouse here first on the list. So how do the animals become infected? Well, they're being spread in the animal population through fighting, right, biting one another, or potentially vertically from mother to child, baby mouse, baby rodent, and generally, in most of these cases, the rodents are not infected by the virus, but they can shed it in their urine and their feces. And then humans are becoming infected when they either eat some contaminated food that some of these rodents had exposure to, or maybe you're working around rodent urine or feces and you're inhaling aerosolized particles that contain urine or feces, or you've got a cut on your skin and you come into contact with urine or feces. There are some arenaviruses that can be transmitted human to human, like Lassa virus, for example, and those are typically going to be through contact directly with bodily secretions that contain a high viral load. Some of these can have very scary fatality rates, so even on the good end, it's like 5%, but some of these up to 50%, so that's alarming. And I mentioned bats, so you can see some of the viruses that are commonly transmitted to humans by bats. We'll focus on Ebola virus here as an example. And so, of course, Ebola is a scary one. It's an interesting one because we've had some more recent outbreaks. So this was first discovered in the mid-1970s with this outbreak of hemorrhagic disease of unknown origin in Africa. With an 88% fatality rate, had about 300 people died in that initial outbreak. In Zaire, and really similar numbers with a slightly lower fatality rate in Sudan at that time. But it was very, very isolated, relatively small number of people infected. It was believed that it was being spread through close person-to-person contact or through sharing of syringes. And that name, Ebola virus, comes from the Ebola River, which was in the general vicinity of that original outbreak in Zaire. So basically, all of the cases of Ebola virus have emerged in Africa originally, other than like accidental infections of researchers in a laboratory setting. So originally, before 1994, all the cases were coming from this small handful of companies of countries. Um, there have been some researchers that have become ill, and of course some like Western healthcare workers have become ill in some of the more recent outbreaks and brought that virus back to the United States, where they were successfully treated. But we had a big recent outbreak in 2014. So this started in West Africa and Guinea, um, and is thought to have started in this very small town with a little toddler, 2-year-old boy that was infected and died in late 2013. So, sort of characteristic Ebola symptoms: high fever, vomiting, black stool indicating internal bleeding. Um, and they believe he may have contracted it just playing outside in a hollow tree, something similar to this, where bats were known to be roosting. So he may have come in contact with bat droppings and become infected that way. And because this is highly contagious through person-to-person contact, we get what we call a spillover event, right? So then as more people become infected, people are getting sick, trying to care for them. Um, another complicating factor in some of these regions of Africa where Ebola has been a big problem, part of the funeral tradition is to actually handle the body before burial, and in fact it may be handled or touched by a large number of people or lots of people in the particular town or village. So then the virus can be spread that way as well. But I mentioned this 2014 spread into 2015 outbreak was really huge. So we were really talking thousands and thousands of cases, right, across a good swath of Western and kind of spilled over into Central Africa, into the Sudan. And here you can see some of the case numbers by country, where in orange here you're seeing the total number of deaths, right? So still fatality rates lower than we saw in those earlier outbreaks, but still pretty alarmingly high. Not something you'd want to take your chances with for sure. So thousands of cases, thousands of deaths, excuse me. And another problem with Ebola, aside from maybe some of these cultural factors that were making the spread worse, of course, you're talking about parts of the world where there is very poor public health infrastructure, right? Lack of resources. You've got healthcare workers that were really unprepared for this rapid outbreak. You think of what it was like in the U.S. with the sudden appearance of COVID-19, right? Everybody's scrambling. Hospitals in heavily affected areas were being overwhelmed, as we saw in New York. So imagine this in a setting where you don't have good hospitals, you don't have good resources, or healthcare workers that are as well trained. Of course, there was a lot of difficulty trying to come up with a containment response. And we also saw in this case, unlike most of the earlier outbreaks, which were in very rural areas, we started seeing outbreaks in more urban areas with higher population density, which of course was aiding in the spread as well. And we put on top of that some kind of built-in cultural mistrust of hospitals in this part of the country, part of the world, lack of compliance. And I used to laugh when I presented this slide, denial of the virus's existence. But we're seeing that even here in the United States, right, with COVID, people saying that's a hoax in some way. So yeah, unfortunately, that's a very real problem that's going to make the spread worse as well. All right, so how is Ebola transmitted? I've mentioned direct person-to-person contact. So coming in contact with broken skin, with mucous membranes, basically coming in contact with any bodily fluid could transmit the virus. It's not a respiratory virus, so you're not going to get it just being close to somebody. You would actually have to come into contact with their bodily fluids. So most often this was going to be either transmitted to family, friends, healthcare workers, right, that were trying to care for somebody infected, or that were, as I mentioned, handling the body of somebody that died of Ebola. Has a pretty long incubation period, could be up to 3 weeks, although more typical would be about a week to a week and a half. And people are not infectious, luckily, until they develop symptoms, so at least you have that warning sign. But unfortunately, the early symptoms, you'll get this sudden onset of, again, just kind of generic virus symptoms, fever, myalgia, headache, that may not raise a lot of red flags. And you'll have that for better part of a week, and then all of a sudden you start seeing some of these much more severe, life-threatening aspects of the disease, just very severe vomiting, diarrhea, and of course what people usually think about with Ebola is the hemorrhagic aspect, bleeding from internally and externally, basically bleeding from every orifice essentially. And that bleeding, that hemorrhaging really comes down to the liver being infected, and it stops producing clotting factors, and you pair that with inflammation, and you basically start bleeding all over the place. So not a pleasant way to go for sure. So hopefully this has given you some feeling for how some of these vector diseases are transmitted, and we've looked at a few examples of some of these vectored emerging viral diseases.